Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm your host, Mark Graban. Our guest today is Andrew Davis. He is the Chief Product Officer at AutoRABIT, and he's author previously of the book Mastering Salesforce DevOps. He's also co-author of a new book written with Steve Pereira titled Flow Engineering, From Value Stream Mapping to Effective Action. Steve's also going to do an episode of My Favorite Mistake, so we'll get the both of them separately and talk about their book and other things. So Andrew is a Salesforce architect, developer, and product leader with a focus on the human side of software development. He's been the leading figure in introducing DevOps concepts to the Salesforce world. And this is interesting. Trained as an engineer, Andrew spent 15 years as a Buddhist monk, teaching meditation and personal transformation and helping develop communities of practice. So now he studies the intersection of business, technology, and psychology through systems thinking. So Andrew, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great. That's a mouthful, Mark. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
I don't think I sometimes hit a speed bump with certain words. I think I got that through that one without any mistakes and all factually correct, even if embarrassing to hear the long intro.
You nailed it, but yes.
Okay. So there's a lot to talk about here today between the book and you've got a unique background. We've had a couple other guests on the podcast before who were also previously Buddhist monks, and not all of them doing the other work that you're doing today. So anyway, we'll get right into the main question at hand. With the different things you've done in your career, Andrew, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
Well, I don't often bump into people who are former Buddhist monks, let alone on podcasts. So yeah, maybe it's a fraternity there that we should I'd love to meet those folks. Figure that
I can make some connections. Yeah.
Thank you. When the opportunity to be on the podcast came up, I was contemplating what was my favorite mistake, and the one that really came to mind was one that I'd not told in any public forum before, but it is the story of how I burned out as a Buddhist monk. And it sounds like a joke. It sounds like the punchline to a joke or something. Because it took me a lot of time and reflection, because it's been 10 years ago now. I did spend 15 years as a monk, so it's a full-on career, and I had made and continually reiterated, a commitment that this was a lifetime commitment. I'm definitely hanging in there. So it was utterly determined for that to be my identity, throughout my life. And it took it's been 10 years since I stopped being a monk, and it was just maybe a couple of years ago, while I was working on writing this book, Flow Engineering with Steve, that I realized that it was burnout in a sense, and that we were a part of a Western Buddhist organization, and so everybody who was there was kind of first generation, and everybody was there because they wanted to. Nobody was there because their parents dragged them in and so forth.
Yeah.
And so it was a really beautiful, good-hearted group of people, and really committed, and really trying to help introduce a dramatically new way of thinking to our world and to our society at a time in our society where, there's all of these existential risks and such a huge need for, different ways of thinking that are more oriented towards harmony and empathy and compassion and so forth. And so I was utterly committed, but I was so committed that I just would work so much again and again. And our organization, we were spread out over the whole world. There wasn't a whole lot of network there for mentoring and cross-checking and, seeing the kinds of, and sharing notes on the kinds of mistakes that people were maybe making, what led people to eventually lose that determination to continue remaining a monk or nun. And I realized that to make a commitment like that, to make a lifetime commitment and, take vows of celibacy and so forth, you've got to be really feeling that spiritual resonance. Like there's got to be something that's moving you really to the depths of your being to say, I'm going to give up all other things in my life,
Right.
all other opportunities and money and partner and all these kinds of things to do this. There's something that's moved you deeply to get to that place, but that's not permanent, right? That sort of feeling of everything's right and I'm doing exactly what I need to be doing and I'm rested and energized and inspired and so forth. That's not permanent. And so that can fade or be damaged over time. And I realized that I didn't take enough care of that experience. And I just sort of gave. And it's a huge issue for nonprofits. And I remember reading research on the burnout rate in nonprofits being just dramatically higher than the rest of the industry. And that's so sad, right? Because they're people like good-hearted, trying to do the best work, and burning out. And I think the so I think a lack of an unskillfulness on my part, and there's an arrogance there as well, because I was feeling like I didn't need to care for my spiritual life, and that as well is one of those amazing ironies, right? Training in a tradition that's all about humility and selflessness, but there's the kind of arrogance that's like, I don't need to, take time to rest. I don't need to, honor, respect these feelings of, I'm working too hard. I'm feeling, and then the failure mode, if you're a monk or non, the failure mode that typically comes up is loneliness, because you're sort of not getting that normal human sort of soothing connection. And that's fine if you're like deeply spiritually absorbed and you sort of transcended loneliness, but you get chinks in the armor, the cracks start appearing, and that kicks up. And so I got into a relationship and crashed and burned as a monk. And
are you blaming the relationship, or that was just also happening, or is all interconnected?
Well, I mean, that is like, to get into a relationship is the end of your life as a monk or nun. So so they're related, but I mean, it was my favorite mistake for all kinds of reasons, just because it unlocked a totally new chapter in my life, and learning how to be in a relationship and learning how to be a good, partner and good in that world was really helpful. And just I made a decision at the time, because the thing that did work really in my favor at that time is I had spent 15 years as a monk teaching people that no matter what happens, you can always take it as a lesson. There's something transformative. There's something you can learn from that. And so I was presented with this dilemma at that time. How should I respond now that I'm no longer a monk? Should I just feel buried under a mountain of shame? Like, okay, I failed this lifetime commitment, failed monk or something like that. Or do I believe the words that I was saying for all those years, that nothing is so, dire a failure that you can't transform it, that you can't learn from it, that you can't use it to make yourself a wiser, better, more compassionate person? And I just thought, I honestly believed in those teachings. Those teachings helped me time and time again when I was a monk. Even this most sort of unthinkable mistake that I could have made, unthinkable mistake that I could have made, that cost me to be an outcast from the community that I was in, and all these kinds of things. Even that can be transformed. And should be transformed and needs to be transformed. So that was my determination. I used to think about the difference between throwing an egg on the ground and throwing a super ball on the ground, right? And my mantra was bounce well, right? It doesn't matter. I've been thrown on the ground, whatever, bounce well. And so that was my favorite mistake.
I mean, it's a really interesting story, and there's probably more we can, dig into a little bit there. I mean, it sounds like, I'm sure it was a struggle. You make this commitment, you want to stick with it, you're committed to it, you're feeling maybe some reasons not to. Was the relationship kind of an exit path? Like I had another guest recently who it was more, different career, like wasn't happy with it and was, kind of sticking with it. I think in hindsight, she said too long, but then she found an exit path and like, okay, well, there was her reason where it was okay to leave.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think so. And I still feel like there's it's like because I was driving so hard, because I noticed those tendencies are still in me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just a bit of workaholic tendency, driving so hard. What happens is there's some part of you that's just craving to say, relax, rest,
Mm-hmm.
you've done enough, right? And getting into a relationship was kind of like, you know, you're always so disciplined, just relax, right? And what I was really craving was relaxation, which again, it sounds like a really
Mm-hmm.
bad joke, right? The Buddhist monk who couldn't relax, right? But like,
Yeah.
yeah, from one level I was relaxed, but I was working, right? So what I was really craving was this just peace of just not having worries, not having to think about something, and and my wife, as she is now, represented that,
Yeah.
and we need that. We need that peace. We need to balance the yang with the yin, so to speak. And
Yeah.
yeah,
So when we think about lessons learned, you mentioned workaholic tendencies. How do you guard against repeating a similar path to burnout in the work that you're doing now? Is that past experience helpful? The Buddhist teachings, all of that helpful?
it 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 is because I'm definitely. I mean, my current role is yeah, has got me moving as hard and as fast as I can to try to keep up with it. And there's lots of pressures and so forth, and I'm away from home a lot as well, right? So the same kind of thing kicks up, like some sense of loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like recognizing that it was. There's a concept in meditation called mental excitement, and typically there's a couple of when you start meditating, there's a couple of things that tend to happen. One is you fall asleep and you get bored or you get dull or whatever. That's mental sinking. The other
Mm-hmm.
one, mental excitement, like you're thinking, you know, too hard. That's mental excitement, and both of those are preventing you from actually having that sweet spot of meditation where you're peaceful but not sleepy and not dull, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I recognized that what was going on in my mind was mental excitement because I was taking on so many responsibilities then. I'm taking on a lot of responsibilities now so that it's
Mm-hmm.
easy for the mind to go, think.
Yeah.
And you always are working. And so you're never giving yourself a chance to just decompress. And like most of the things that many people do to decompress, I still don't do, right? Like no drinking and just watching lots of TV and doing mindless stuff. I don't choose to take that approach to take my mind off things.
Right.
But if you don't take that approach, you need another way to like just say cut the excitement, because the excitement is said to be like a bad boss. This mental
Mm-hmm.
excitement is said to be like a bad boss that's always saying, when's the next thing going to be done? You
Mm-hmm.
know, it wasn't enough. You know, can you elaborate on that more? And we
Right.
know that feeling as we're American, or you Canadian, I guess maybe. But anyway, we're in that same culture,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so knowing that we need to rest, we need to that piece is important.
Yeah. That resonates with me personally. I have my own company. I'm my own boss. The boss in my head is sometimes that bad boss. So by
Mhm.
sometimes, I mean quite often.
Yeah,
Right. So I've had similar struggles there of giving myself permission
yeah,
to rest or to relax. And I that struggle is real sometimes of like, go, 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 go. Now I don't have trouble falling asleep, but there's sometimes not a lot of transition between maybe, mental excitement and then I
yeah,
manage to turn it off and go to sleep. But like, okay, there's middle ground
yeah.
as you're describing. And I did try a meditation app during the pandemic, and yeah, I would tend to doze off. I related to that too. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not good at meditation, which maybe the point is not to be good at it.
I think it it's totally nobody's good at anything the first time you try it, right? Everything's.
Right.
I'm not good at ice skating. I'm not good at
Yeah.
basketball. Like, but the thing is, we meditate. We just don't necessarily realize that that's what we're doing. So there's things like when you're focused and absorbed in something and the world disappears, you're just absorbed into that. That's a kind of meditation. When you gain some insight and you're just really dwelling on that and really trying to savor it. You run a very thoughtful podcast, so I'm sure there's a lot, of insights that you pick up, and where you're just savoring that itself is a
Mhm.
meditation. But
Mm.
it's like maybe just even for a few seconds at a time. Um, and it's learning how to extend those moments of
Mhm.
insight and let them soak in more deeply.
Mhm.
Meditation can be just another excuse for us to feel inadequate. Like a lot of us are very
Yeah.
driven anyway,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and that's kind of depriving it of the joy that it will naturally bring.
Yeah. It's almost maybe an opposite of Dunning-Kruger syndrome, where you say, well, I know I'm not good at this, so I'm going to stop doing it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Or that tendency. I mean, I play drums, and I've gotten back into that in the past year. And to me, that's as close to, I think, a meditative state, even though I'm obviously I'm moving, I'm playing, but I'm pretty present. Like I manage, a different part of my brain
Yeah.
turns on that I think turns off other stuff. So it's a great stress reliever. I enjoy doing it, the musicality of it, and I think it is a little meditative.
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely a state of concentration. The way I think about meditation is it's a type of concentration that's motivated by a good intention, and so playing the drums, absolutely a type of concentration. And then the what would make that a meditation is the motivation with which you go into it, and then
Mm,
especially if you're doing something with a motivation to help others
mhm,
or to transform yourself to be a better person, long term, and for the sake of others. That's what really makes it into a meditation. It's
mhm. Yeah.
yeah.
So I want to ask, two other questions before we talk about the book. I mean, kind of the career decisions. You said it was a choice. How did you choose first to become Buddhist and then to become a monk? And then how did you choose then to get into, the software and technology world?
Yeah. I was a nerdy little kid, so I had some math science bent, through school.
Yeah.
But I was also, I'd say, kind of thoughtful and sensitive and thinking about big questions and wanting to make my life meaningful very much, and not wanting to be around just to use up space, consume a lot of food, consume a lot of natural resources, and so forth. And so,
Yeah.
from pretty early on in my life, I was really weighing this question about there needs to be a good reason for me to stick around on Earth, uh, and so I thought, what is the root cause? I was very concerned about environmental problems and social problems and wars and these kinds of things. And I was thinking, what's the root cause of all of these issues? And I came to the conclusion when I was around 15 or 16 that the root cause of all these problems was that humans were crazy.
Mm,
And that the most useful contribution I could make would be to try to help humans to be less crazy. And if I
mhm.
want to do that, then I'm going to have to be less crazy.
Yeah.
And if I'm going to be less crazy, I'm going to need to come under the influence of someone who doesn't seem to be crazy. And I, bumped into some, the example of Buddha and some teachings around that time. And I just thought, this is not crazy. This seems to be not
Mhm,
crazy. Like this focus on internal peace, building your own wisdom, compassion, um, that feels not crazy. And so I
mhm,
just made a decision in high school around that time to become a Buddhist monk, and it took me a number of years to figure out how to do that.
mhm.
Um, I guess, well, during those couple of years, I went to school for engineering, which
Yeah.
a lot of my cousins had done because none of the universities I was looking at had a Buddhist monk program. So I didn't know how to
Yeah,
do
I mean, how common is that? I mean, so you go to the equivalent of a seminary
I don't know.
for Buddha?
Not in
No,
America. If
no?
you're
Okay.
my wife's Korean. In Korea,
Mhm.
you can do that.
Yeah.
In America, that just doesn't happen.
Okay.
There aren't such programs. Um, uh, and so I was just kind of wandering, and I did what my cousins had done, which is go into Virginia Tech, get a degree in engineering. So I
Yeah.
did that. So I had a lot of technical skills and background. When after university, I uh, anyway, there's
Yeah.
longer versions of the story, but I wound up just taking some random job, and it was like an hour away from my home. So I'd commute in the dark in the morning, work a long day, commute in an hour back in the evening, and at one point I'm sitting in traffic, and I'm just like, okay, well, that's it. I'm working for the man. The dream's over. Never
Yeah.
mind. All dreams are broken in the end. So I just, and then I bumped into a flyer for a meditation,
Ah. Hmm.
and then went to that and started going back and connected with a meditation center. And when I showed up there, in addition to learning meditation, volunteering in other ways, they needed help with some technical things. So I would do
Oh,
some web design and graphic
yeah.
design. And so I kept some of my tech skills warm. And so when I left the life of being a monk, it was a pretty easy, my last few years as a monk, I was the director of IT for the global Buddhist organization. So that made it pretty easy to figure out what I was going to do when I was not.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah. Because that desire to help people, had you not run into the meditation center, I mean, there could have been pathways into becoming a counselor or mental health professional, perhaps, but this opportunity presented itself to you to help
Yeah,
that way. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And my dad was a therapist, a
Okay.
psychotherapist, and he had a lot of influence on me. But I think there's something about, well, I'm not going to do what he did, you know.
Sure.
You, so I'm going to be a techie kind of person, and so, but I think in a sense, I've ended up as some kind of a hybrid techie mental health person.
Yeah. Right.
And I'd like to think that had I
Well,
not become a monk, I'd have done something else in the
well,
benevolent strain. But yeah,
yeah. So companies can be crazy, or quite often are. So how do we help avoid that? Maybe that starts getting to the topic of your book, Flow Engineering.
yeah,
So maybe let's transition to talk about some of the concepts there, and
yeah,
kind of open ended question. Kind of give us the overview of that book.
sure, great. So, flow engineering is just came out last month, and it was a collaboration with my now very close friend Steve Pereira. And originally, I had written this book on DevOps for Salesforce, and I had become very interested in value stream mapping from talks by Jez Humble, and he just really came highly recommended as a way to in, increase increase clarity, reduce the waste in any kind of process in an organization, including in the software development process. And I saw the reason I got into DevOps for Salesforce, I started as a Salesforce developer, and then I just saw there was so much time being wasted and so much effort was being wasted,
Mhm.
so much just confusion. And a lot of it due to people, information being fragmented. You're working on your thing and I'm working on my thing, and I don't realize that the mistakes that I'm making are causing you problems. I'm not checking the security on my code, and so somebody else has to do rework or whatever. And so many of those issues can be resolved by just bringing people together and visualizing the work process
Right.
and clarifying what it is that we're trying to be focused on, and then looking at, what are the parts of the work process that are really causing pain for everybody, and what can we do to resolve them. And it's basically a conversation. It's a structured conversation with visualization activities. And so in the course of work, meeting Steve, talking with him and so forth, we realized we just shared so much common passion flow with two meanings. There's the internal flow state, being in a state of flow. I would say when you're playing the drums, you're in a flow state. Flow state is a state of concentration. And so flow state is very closely aligned with meditation. And, as I was a software developer as well. When I was writing code, if my wife came in and she's like, "Oh, it's time for lunch," I'm like, "Not now. I'll be 2 hours. If you interrupt me now, I'll forget everything. I've got this."
Yeah, right.
So you're in a state of flow. So I really appreciated the beauty and the power of it's the flow state that is responsible for all the really high quality code, high quality architecture, great insights, everything all the innovation that makes companies run well comes
or writing a book. You get into a flow state, hopefully, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if you can get into a flow state, it's easy. And if you can't get into a flow state, it's hard.
Right.
And that's true of so many things in an organization. So we want, ideally, everybody in the organization would stay in a state of flow all the time. But the problem is, when you're in a state of flow, you forget about everybody else. And so I'm not thinking about you and what you're dealing with and so forth. And so when you've got to find a balance between individual flow and the creativity that it brings, and collective workflow, which involves some degree of distraction. And this is not exactly, ideally, I wouldn't even have to think about what Mark's doing, but now that I know what Mark's working on, I understand that I need to do things a certain way to make things work for Mark. And so the idea of figuring out what we can do to enable collaborative workflow and also, maximize the degree to which people are able to stay in an internal state of flow, because there really is a tension between those, but that's really what the book is about.
Yeah. And you mentioned value stream mapping, and there's a number of connections that come to mind. I mean, that's a tool I've used for a long time in manufacturing. It has origins, as you know, in manufacturing. It's an adaptation of something credited to Toyota of mapping out material flow, information flow. I've helped a lot of organizations in healthcare use a value stream map because those organizations are so silo focused. So, you have a department focusing on its work, and it really doesn't know what happens when the patient or the tube of blood gets passed on to the next department. So I've seen the power of just getting everybody into a room and let's map out that entire value stream that goes across these different departments and functions. And then, you're not having to tell people what the problems are. They're discovering it. And then they start thinking like, okay, as long as you can get past whatever feelings of shame they might have, sometimes people get embarrassed. I don't know if you've seen this in software or tech circles, where now that you map it out and it's eye opening. And then there's even with technical people, there can be some feelings involved, but then we can start breaking down silos and coming up with solutions. I think my experience with this is that's an incredibly powerful tool, even if there are waves of emotion that happen along the way. I'm curious what your thoughts are on all of that.
Yeah, and we had the other conversation on your Lean blog podcast, and you brought up the same example, and it moved me, and it stuck in my mind the idea that in the healthcare field, as you mentioned, you've got really conscientious people, right? People who got into that field because they, nurses and so forth, because they wanted to help, right? They've got a motivation of benevolence. They have a very strong pro-social motivation, very empathetic. The last thing they want to do is harm a patient, create a risk, or even harm their coworkers and so forth.
Right.
And as you point out, that discovery of like, I had no idea I was causing problems. I was putting the patient at risk and so forth. That emotional wave. What's fascinating to me is that I had gone into being a monk really because I'm like, okay, the world is broken. Corporate capitalism is a disaster. We're destroying the earth. I don't want anything to do with normal mainstream society. And so I really tried to create a lot of distance between myself and most organizations. And, Western healthcare is too expensive and all these kinds of things. I'll just do, I was interested in Eastern medicine for a long time. But then coming back, you sort of eventually come back around and you realize that these cold, cruel, capitalistic corporations are filled with people.
Mm.
With feelings,
Right.
who are trying to do a good job, trying to work with their coworkers and so forth. And I realized my wife had warned me before after I was left being a monk, before I got a job, she said, you're going to have a real culture shock entering into the cold, cruel, capitalistic world. Everybody's just focused on money and so forth. I'm like, all right, I'll brace myself. I've seen worse. And I got into this consulting company, and it was a serious culture shock. And I was
Mm.
really shocked at how incredibly generous everybody was,
Oh. Mm-hmm.
how incredibly patient they were, at how
Yeah.
incredibly concerned about the customers they were, at how they would, um, just be attentive to all the little details. And it was very humbling for me,
Yeah.
because I thought I was in the virtue business. I was like a professional virtue person.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh, you guys amateurs, right? Everybody else is.
Yeah.
And then you come and I'm like, God, these people are more patient than I am. They're more generous than I am. They're more concerned really about the customer than I am. And I realized that for any organization to function, there's got to be some virtue flowing through its veins. There's like an
Yeah.
undercurrent of, I can't work with you if I can't trust, that you're not going to steal my stuff and, or
Right.
intentionally try to harm or make my life difficult. That if you've got that virtuous foundation, you can build a harmonious organization. And if you don't
Yeah.
have a foundation of basic and not so basic ethics and virtue and consideration, everything gets harder.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
If not impossible.
I mean, it's interesting to think about the values or virtues or principles of individuals. And on some level, a company is nothing but a collection of people. But at the same time, I don't know where these disconnects come from. When we talk about mistakes, for example, and psychological safety, and I'd like to delve into that a little bit more with you. But I've found like individuals tend to readily agree with the statement like, we're all human, we're all going to make mistakes, they're unintentional, like you shouldn't punish mistakes. But then somehow organizationally, an organization that's full of maybe a majority or a vast majority of people who share that individual view, somehow people get into a leadership position and somehow they're taught like, well, you have to punish people. And like somehow the leaders are acting in ways that seem like really inconsistent with what the individual views would be of people in that company. Or even that leader who's punishing someone for a mistake might have an individual belief versus the role they feel like they have to play as a leader. I mean, I don't have a good answer for why. I observe this disconnect. I don't know if others share that view, yet alone what the solution is.
Yeah, one thing that was coming to my mind was this, the famous old Stanford prison experiment, right? Philip Zimbardo ran this experiment where if you dress somebody up in a white lab coat, you can get, and the person in the white lab coat says, hey, press this button, and you can give an electric shock to that other person, and people would just do what they were told, even if it looked like they were seriously hurting or killing the other person, right? So there's a an institutional insensitivity. And it's interesting because on one level you need a certain kind of, it's very tricky because we want to be sensitive and empathetic, but at some point when you're making decisions at scale, you do need to desensitize yourself a little
Mm-hmm.
bit, that think about the bigger picture and kind of average things out. And so you can get policies that are insensitive, and then they just get imposed, through the institutional culture, and then you can build a momentum around these assumed behaviors of what we're supposed to be like. That I think it's in the lean community that it talks a lot about the importance of being lean now and early, and so that we don't have to make these major corrections like a massive reduction in force later.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you do lots of small continuous improvements. So you always know you're staying as close to optimal as you can, because on one level, the consequences, whether in the near term or long term, will be painful for the organization,
Right.
and then there's this basic process of being born as a living being and trying to figure out this difference between I'm in here and everybody else is out there, and the big world is scary and I'm scared, and I just try to act like I know what's going on. And then, you know, we learn how to bully, and be bullied and avoid being
Hmm.
bullied, and
Yeah.
so you get these very childish behaviors of like, oh, they're the bad group, and you get these cliques forming, and it all gets a lot of that gets smoothed out as we get older, but I think some of those things still linger, right?
Yeah.
Blaming somebody, you did it, and
Yeah. 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 And there's bullying in workplaces uh, far too often. But and how much of that I'm trying to remember. I'm not an expert on that prison experiment, but isn't part of the dynamic there of being placed in a position of power, of like you are a guard and these other people are prisoners and you have power over them,
maybe
and what people, if some switch flips in people's head, or that dynamic of having power and being able to use it or not wanting to lose it.
right, right,
I
right,
mean,
right. That yeah, I should refresh my memory of the details there.
well,
Yes, but I think there's a lot of these things that are well known by sociologists. I have a friend who's a sociologist. She's in Israel. Leah, hi Leah, um, um, Leah Hagol. She is a professor of sociology, and sociology is not the most respected discipline in the world or the university. Like you go to you get a sociology degree, you end up being a social worker. And social workers tend to, it's not the most prestigious job, not the most well-paid job. A lot of people
right.
burn out from social work and so forth.
Yeah.
And I was saying to her that, sociology feels like the most important domain, most important subject, because it's like we're all fish in this
Yeah.
sociological ocean. And
Right.
none of us know what an ocean is. None of us realize that we're living in this sociological world, that we're living in this highly conditioned, and any sociologist coming into our company, anybody's company, would be able to say, oh, look at the power dynamics there, and
Hmm.
look at
Yeah.
the factions forming here, and a defensive reaction here, and it would be transparent. It would be blatantly obvious
Yeah.
if you had a scientific observer, a sociologist
Right.
observing the corporate dynamics. But when you're in it, you can't see it because you're in it, and it's invisible, right? And
Yeah.
you're subject to it. And then you're driven by these instinctive tendencies and your own tendency to react, and anger and
Yeah.
attachment, and yeah.
Here, I'm going to grab a book off the shelf here. Because I think for better or for worse, sometimes for worse, and I'm an engineer, so I'm going to throw stones. At engineers, a lot of the early lean books were written by engineers.
Hmm.
The disciplines out of, Toyota was being led and developed by engineers and industrial engineers like myself. We learn about these things in school, and lots of engineering perspectives. But I don't know if you're familiar with the Toyota Way.
Sure.
By Jeffrey Liker. His PhD is in sociology.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, it's just great to have perspectives, and his books and, in this series tend to focus much more on things like mindsets and philosophies and behaviors and
Right.
things that are maybe ultimately the most important
Right.
within a workplace.
Right.
Lean or otherwise.
That's the amazing power of these sort of cross-disciplinary overlaps. When you get somebody like Jeffrey Liker, and you show them Toyota and how they operate, they see a very different thing than you, as sort of, if you were a naive industrial engineer, you'd come and you'd say, oh yeah, the assembly lines and manufacturing and handoffs and so forth. And then the training, that trained eye to see the sociological dimension, they see a totally different world.
Yeah. And so, one of the books he co-authored in the series, Toyota Culture, is the only one that I've found that explicitly uses the phrase psychological safety in the way, we talk about creating, an environment where people feel safe to speak up. And you see evidence of that in, so many Toyota practices. And you and Steve, touch on this in the book, in Flow Engineering. So maybe as maybe a final question here, I'm curious your thoughts on what you've learned about psychological safety, why that was something that's emphasized in the book.
Yeah, I really appreciate you raising it and sort of keeping it in people's attention, because I think we don't realize how much remains unspoken if there's not a psychologically safe environment.
Right.
And when things remain unspoken, then they remain unaddressed. And
Right.
you and I might have the exact same worries, the exact same concerns, but if neither of us ever voice it, then we don't realize that there's anybody else who knows it. And so the insights that we have, they die in isolation, right?
Mm-hmm.
When there's not psychological safety. So it's psychological safety that allows for there to be an opening and a free flow of values, of basically of feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And the whole book, Flow Engineering, is really about what we call the elements of action. Feeling, or value as the epitome of feeling, clarity as the epitome of thinking, and flow as the epitome of action. So these basic three elements, the three main active psychological elements. But the book is really about breaking down the barriers between people, so you get shared values, shared clarity and insights, shared flow, shared behavior. And the precondition for that is sense of psychological safety. If there's not a sense of psychological safety, you trigger the most basic reaction that any living being has, which is, it's not safe for me to share. And I experienced, one of the reasons I have so much gratitude for Steve and the book project together is that I just felt at ease with him. And I felt comfortable sharing ideas that were more kind of on the fringe that I'd not shared before in the workplace, because I was quite guarded. I was in the closet as a former monk. I didn't make any indication of that for the first 2 years, at least, that I was in the company. I was very guarded, very cautious about what I indicated, my, whatever wacky observations or thoughts I'd have. It took me a while, and I'm still easing out of that. I'm still trying to find more, including this podcast, telling that story that I'd never told before in a public forum. So trying to find that comfort and ease being myself. And then, you realize that some people will resonate with it. And the people who don't resonate with it, at least they'll be better informed. They'll understand. And hopefully they won't use it against you, but that's the risk that you take, but you build your courage, right? And so we talked in the other Lean podcast about it's important to create an environment of psychological safety to help draw out that courage and relaxation and confidence. But the more you do that, the more you can internalize a sense of psychological safety and not need such a sort of gentle environment. And really the full maturation of psychological safety is that everybody feels so psychologically safe with each other that we know we can point out each other's mistakes and faults without hurting each other.
Right. We can disagree and disagree back, or right. And
that's the maturation of it, is that I feel totally safe telling you that was a terrible idea and you really need to never do that again, because it's going to cause all of these problems and so forth. And I know it's not going to damage our friendship. I know it's not going to be a fatal, crushing blow to your ego.
Right.
So that's the maturation. It has to start like a child, right? It starts very gentle, very small, very fragile, as you're building culture.
Yeah, because I think without psychological safety, bringing it back to the value stream mapping, if people don't feel safe pointing out a problem in the value stream. One thing that comes up a lot of times in healthcare, where there's a lot of variation in how people were taught and trained and how they do their work. You're mapping out a value stream, and inevitably there's somebody in the room who wants to say, and hopefully they feel safe raising their hand and saying, that's not how we do it on our shift, or that's not how I do it. And we should highlight that and talk through it. If they feel like the response is going to be getting in trouble for not doing it the quote unquote standard way,
Right.
that issue might remain hidden.
Right. 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 Right.
So
Right.
I love the way you call it, a precondition. When
Mm.
I was taught that word of like, breathing is a precondition for value stream mapping as well. It's not a nice to have.
Yeah. I mean, well, breathing in the sense of being alive, and then just breathing
Right.
in the sense of like, okay, let's just calm down and none of us get defensive and so forth. So there's that kind of breathing. That's also really
Sure.
a great catalyst for having that kind of honest discussion.
Yeah. Well, again, our guest today has been Andrew Davis, co-author most recently of the book Flow Engineering: From Value Stream Mapping to Effective Action. We're going to do an episode with his co-author, Steve Pereira. I'm going to ask a final question that, Steve has a different background and doesn't do this. You offer some free classes on personal transformation.
I do, actually.
It's on your website. If you could tell us about that a little bit here as we wrap up.
Sure. Yeah. It was, again, as I was gradually coming out of the closet as a former Buddhist monk and figuring out how to integrate these two worlds. It was during the pandemic, and there were all these resources coming out around, mental health and, here's how you can deal with all the stress and the anxiety of lockdown and so forth. And I sort of very shyly and slowly started doing some YouTube videos and offered to coworkers, hey, I'd be happy to offer some meditation classes. And I got a very, very warm response from lots of coworkers. Not everybody, but it's self-selecting, right?
Sure.
So my wife and I have now set up a nonprofit meditation center called the Center for Harmonious Living in San Diego, and it's kind of online. And so if you go to chill.life, CHL.life, Center for Harmonious Living.life, you'll see the links to the Sunday meditation class, free, open to everybody, as well as the other programs we're offering.
So is that chill with two L's .life, or was it
No,
one?
it's CHL. It's Center for Harmonious Living, but I say
CHL. Okay.
chill.
CHL.life. Don't make a mistake of going to a wrong or non-existent website.
I should probably see if I can get chill.life, the actual word spelled out.
Yeah, at CHL.life. Andrew, this has been great doing a second podcast with you. I really enjoy the conversation. Thank you for sharing that story with us and your reflections and lessons learned. Really, really great stuff. Thanks.
Wonderful interview. So grateful to for what you're doing with the podcast, and wonderful to have the conversation, Mark. Thanks.
Thank you.